Anytime there's a Sonic racing game, there's always a discussion of why are Sonic and friends all racing around in vehicles when they're faster than that on foot. And normally the conversation always goes to Sonic R as the Sonic game where you actually do race on foot, and there's always this lamentation when people talk about that game of like, that's a really good idea that people want to see done again. There's a lot of potential in a Sonic racing game where you're just running around on foot, taking advantage of these characters' speed and abilities. And that conversation almost always seems to just completely ignore the existence of the Sonic Rivals games, which I guess isn't too surprising considering they were PSP exclusives. And also, you know, they're 2D games, and I think people are generally more talking about they want a 3D Sonic racing game on foot. But still, if you want some Sonic foot racing action, then the Sonic Rivals games do absolutely provide that, and in my opinion, they do it much, much better than Sonic R did. I mean, that's not a very high bar. It's not like Sonic R is a particularly great racing game or anything. But more than just being a better realization of the idea of a Sonic racing game where the characters are racing on foot, I think the Sonic Rivals games are very, very interesting because, in my opinion at least, they kind of blur the line a little bit between spin-off and almost something that's kind of like a mainline Sonic game in a way. I mean, I know throughout this series I've made a couple of claims about certain games being mainline that people have definitely disagreed with me on. And this is probably going to be the biggest case of that, because, like, yeah, Sonic Rivals is a spin-off, it's a racing game instead of a traditional platformer, like most Sonic games are. But at the same time, look at the gameplay here. Does this really seem to you to be that different from mainline Sonic games? Because upon revisiting the Rivals games for the first time in I don't even know how many years, I was very surprised to see that there is a lot of traditional core Sonic design and philosophy in the DNA of the Rivals games. And if you think about it, in Sonic Adventure you had that gameplay with Tails where you're doing traditional Sonic platforming, but you're racing against someone else and you have to get to the end before them. So this is kind of like extrapolating on that idea, but turning it into an entire game, which I think you could argue is kind of worth being called mainline, sort of, in a way, maybe. The main reason I started to think this is because when you start playing the Sonic Rivals games, you realize that they're really not that different from a traditional Sonic platformer. I mean, it's worth saying up front that in terms of, like, physics and controls, these games are not amazing. I mean, you can get used to them, but there are definitely a lot of quirks and problems here, and a lot of jank and inconsistency, and just, they're very unpolished games, is what I'm saying. And as far as being 2D Sonic platformers go, these definitely fall into the category of the Sonic 4 kind rather than the Sonic Advance kind, where they do not at all accurately recreate Sonic physics in any way. These are some fucking glue your shoes to the walls kinds of games, but that kind of makes sense considering they have these big set pieces here that you really couldn't get through with, like, traditional Sonic physics. You do kind of need to fudge things a bit if you want to have these because, you know, this is a game directed by Takashi Iizuka, and we all know how much he loves to shove big pointless set pieces where you just do nothing but go forward into Sonic. And Sonic Rivals has plenty of those, let me tell ya. There are a lot of sequences in these levels where you literally do nothing but hold right as a bunch of shit just happens on the screen. Not exactly my favorite. It's also worth noting that rolling is a really bad thing to do in the Rivals games because it does not work like how it does in most Sonic games. You do not gain more speed going downhill while rolling. All it does is cause you to slow down faster, so you pretty much never want to be rolling in the Rivals games if you can avoid it. Which also makes the spin dash not super useful, and the spin dash in general is just really awkward and shitty in these games. But one cool thing that they have added to this game is you can press up to exit the rolling state and go back to running, which is pretty cool. That's something I would definitely like to see implemented in more of the mainline Sonic games. That said, while the physics of Sonic Rivals aren't perfect, they do still try to kind of resemble traditional Sonic physics in a way. You do still accelerate up to your base movement speed, and you do speed up while going downhill and slow down when going uphill. It's a very subtle effect, it's not too pronounced, but it is there, and in fact you can even slope jump in these games, where, when you're going up a slope you can jump and get extra height and distance, and when you're going downhill and you jump, then you'll jump forward and gain some extra speed. That's actually surprising to see something like that actually works in these games. Although for some reason the upward slope jump only works when you're on rails. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's how it works, because Sonic Rivals jank. And as far as jumping off of walls goes, Jesus Christ, it's a giant fucking mess. Don't try to loop jump, because loops don't work off of physics in this game. Like the 3D games, they're scripted, and if you try to do anything but hold forward, they're just gonna get all kinds of fucked up, and who knows what the hell is going to happen. Yeah, these games can be very, very janky. I guess that's kind of the signature of Sonic games directed by Takashi Iizuka. In fact, it's pretty easy to tell that the Sonic Rivals games, both of them, are pretty unfinished. There is quite a bit of T-posing that you occasionally see sometimes in certain situations with the characters, which is kind of just really funny. I've already got plenty of time under my belt with shitty, janky Sonic games that barely work, so you know what? I'm used to it at this point. I kind of expect it, and I'm almost at this point like, good, there's that familiar, comfortable, shitty Sonic jank that sucks and is really bad feeling and really bad controlling. What would a Sonic game be without that? So yeah, not exactly the best as far as 2D Sonic physics goes, but, if you get used to it, it's playable. I know there are many people out there that find 2D Sonic games that don't have proper Genesis physics to be unacceptable, but as I've said in the past with the handheld Sonic games, I don't absolutely need perfect classic-style Sonic physics. As long as things play well enough and it's fun, then I can be okay with that, but I do prefer if we can try to get something more faithful to Sonic, especially if we manage to at least in other ways maintain the spirit and design philosophy of the Sonic games like the Sonic Rush games managed to do. And that is actually something that Rivals kind of manages to succeed at a little bit, particularly in its level design. I guess it's worth mentioning that the developers of this game was not anyone that had worked on Sonic games before. The developer of this game was actually an American studio called Backbone, who worked with Sonic Team kind of in a similar way that Dimps did on all the other handheld games. And I actually read in an interview that for the development of Sonic Rivals, the team was actually given the maps of every single level in a previous 2D Sonic game all the way up to Sonic Rush, and they studied those maps extensively in order to make the levels of Sonic Rivals, and I would say that absolutely shows in the level design of these games, because they absolutely maintain traditional Sonic level design philosophy. The multi-tiered routes with the top paths being the fastest and all that, it's totally all here in Sonic Rivals, which is pretty impressive. Not only do the levels in these games have the structure you would expect in typical 2D Sonic games, but they're also fairly well designed, I would say. Like, whoever worked on the level design for these levels did a really good job. They have everything, right down to the passivity traps that punish you for just mindlessly holding right. That is pretty cool. And they actually do something in this game where they have these little things that launch you either up or forward depending on what button you press, and they'll tell you which way is the optimal way to go, and sometimes the top path actually isn't the optimal way to go, but you kind of just end up instinctually doing that, as most of the time when avoiding passivity traps and stuff, jumping is the thing to do. And a lot of times, if you just rest on your laurels, then you're going to end up actually going on a slower path than you could have gone on if you went on the middle path as directed by the prompt, which is pretty cool. A bit of a way to develop that traditional Sonic level design a little bit further in a way that works pretty well. And this whole level design structure that you see typical of Sonic games actually works fairly well, I would say, for a racing game, because Sonic games kind of already were like single-player racing games, where they were about trying to get your best time. You were competing against your previous best time. And so the idea of just throwing in another player and now you're real-time racing with them, that actually totally works, where if you fall behind from your opponent, if they end up messing up and taking lower routes later on, but you end up playing well and taking those upper routes, then it gives you an opportunity to catch up to them. That just works, it just makes sense. Although I guess it could potentially lead to a problem where if the player gets ahead and they just don't make any mistakes, then they're just going to continually end up with even more and more of a lead, but that's kind of just how racing games work, right? I mean, it's not too surprising that this works as a racing game structure for Sonic, because this is already how a lot of the multiplayer modes in most Sonic games already worked. The only difference is the Rivals games are specifically designed for that two-player mode to be the primary way to play, rather than being the side mode that's kind of taking a single-player game and trying to adapt it to multiplayer. Of course, though, like typical kind of party racers like Mario Kart and stuff, Sonic Rivals also does have items that you can use to fuck with your opponents that you can pick up throughout the race, and a lot of these are the typical kinds of things: a projectile that will hit them and slow them down, ice that will freeze them for a couple seconds, you know, the usual things that you would expect. But one cool thing is that every item can be used both offensively and defensively depending on what position you're in. Like, for example, with the fireball item, if you're in second place, then you shoot a fireball forward that will hunt down your opponent. But if you're in first place, then it actually creates a fire shield that will protect you from one hit of damage for a couple seconds. Cool little idea there, I like that. In addition to fucking with your opponent with items, you also do have the ability to just attack them, either with a ground attack that you can do, or you can homing attack your opponent, which obviously you would expect to be able to do this kind of thing, but there is a bit of an issue with this in the first Rivals, in that if you're in front, then there's absolutely no way to avoid getting attacked by the opponent. Like, yeah, if they try the grounded attack, then you can jump over it, but if they homing attack you, you're getting hit by that. There's really nothing you can do. And that actually creates for some awkward scenarios where if you're slightly in front of your opponent, you're basically fucked, because at any moment they can just homing attack you and take the lead. Though even that can sometimes be awkward, because depending on the timing and placement of where you do the homing attack, you might actually end up falling behind your opponent for attacking them, which is really fucking weird. This whole thing is very, very awkward and very strange. It's also worth mentioning that I have never played either of the Rivals games competitively against another person before, so I have no fucking idea how these work as actual racing games, but I'm gonna assume that they're probably really fucked up and can't really be taken seriously. Fortunately, they do manage to be pretty fun as single-player games. As far as single-player goes, in Rivals you have the story mode, where you get to play through the game as each of the 4 characters, and they each have their own different story, you know, typical Sonic structure that you would see in a lot of Sonic games at this time. Though, a lot of people complained in, like, Sonic Heroes that it had that problem that they make you play the game 4 times, but in Rivals, that issue is far, far worse than it is in any other Sonic game, because all of the characters in Sonic Rivals play completely identically to one another. Knuckles can't glide or climb, Shadow doesn't have chaos powers, Silver can't use his telekinesis. None of that. Everyone is basically a clone of Sonic, with the air dash and homing attack and whatever. Which, I understand them doing that because that's how you make a fair game, because, you know, with how the Sonic abilities work, if you make a game primarily that's meant to be a racing game competitively, then you run into the issue of one character just being objectively better than another character depending on the level because of their abilities. You would get an unfair advantage, so you don't want to do that, so we just give everyone the exact same moveset. Makes sense for gameplay purposes, but it really makes playing through the story mode, if you want to do the whole thing, a bit of a chore, because you literally play through the exact same game 4 times with almost no changes. At the very least, in Sonic Heroes, you had slightly different movesets, and the level design was slightly rearranged per every playthrough, but here it is literally the exact same game over and over and over. Though there is one thing that makes all the characters stand out from each other, which is that there is this star item that you can occasionally pick up, and this activates your character's unique special ability, and this is the one thing where every character is actually unique. Although these abilities don't really do a particularly great job of making the characters really stand out from each other, because for the most part they all pretty much do the same thing. The only one that's unique is Sonic, that gives him a giant burst of speed for a couple of seconds, kind of, you know, sort of giving him the boost. But all the other characters, they don't actually have an ability that they get to use to do anything, to traverse the level in some kind of unique way. They're just attacks that exist to slow down the opponent. Knuckles will stun you for a couple seconds, Shadow will slow you down for a couple seconds, and Silver will fuck with all of your controls for a couple seconds, which, I mean, those don't really do anything particularly different for each other. They all ultimately achieve the same thing of just fucking with your opponent and slowing them down, so, bleh. And once you complete the game, then you eventually do unlock Metal Sonic as a playable character, who his special ability is just that he copies the ability of whoever he's racing against. So I guess if you do want to have perfectly fair and balanced races, then you can just pit Metal Sonic against anyone, and there you go. So yeah, playing through the story mode of Sonic Rivals, here's the thing, it's fun the first time you do it because the game is actually pretty good and well designed and fun, and it kind of just feels a bit like a traditional Sonic game, except you're racing with somebody else. It's just the fact that doing it 4 times if you want to unlock everything, that kind of just sucks. But it's not too terrible because Sonic games inherently are pretty replayable, and I would say that Sonic Rivals also manages to achieve that to a degree. I would say it's not exactly as replayable as more traditional, better Sonic games are, but, you know, I was able to play through it a couple of times without getting bored. Though by the time I got to the 4th playthrough, I was kind of starting to feel it a little bit. It's also worth noting that another way that the Rivals games are just like traditional Sonic games is they follow traditional Sonic structure. You got zones with 2 acts and then a boss fight. And bosses are very weird in Rivals because it's a competitive game, and so the bosses are not simply that you have to defeat them. In fact, defeating the bosses is basically free in these fights because you can't actually really die. If you die, then you just respawn right where you are and keep going. The actual objective here is you have to land more hits on the boss than the opponent does, and its first one to a certain score value wins. Which is kinda cool and an interesting way to make competitive boss fights in this game, but ultimately the bosses themselves are very similar to your typical 2D Sonic bosses, which is to say they're not particularly great. And the AIs are really fucking stupid, and they don't really put up much of a fight, so you can kind of just mostly ignore them. Though, again, I haven't played Rivals against actual people, so who knows, maybe if you actually played these bosses competitively, they could be pretty intense and cool, I don't know. Once you beat the 4 campaigns in story mode, though, then Sonic Rivals doesn't really have a whole lot to offer in terms of extra content. There is this kind of card collection thing in the game, but this is kind of a weird thing. As you play through the game, you're gonna eventually get a bunch of cards, and if you collect cards in sets, then you can unlock special certain things, primarily like costumes for the different characters, which, you know, that's neat, who doesn't like costumes? But the thing about getting these cards is that you actually get them randomly, and the way you earn these cards is also not exactly the best, because you earn them for completing challenges on all of the levels once you go into, like, free play mode. You can play every single level in the game on 3 different difficulties, either easy, medium, or hard, which I think the only difference is how competent the AI opponent is supposed to be. But even at the hardest, I really don't find them to be that threatening, so it's not really that different. And the problem with these challenges is that, for one, they are all the exact same challenges on every single level on every single difficulty, but also the issue is that you do not unlock the challenges of lower difficulties for doing them on higher difficulties. You know, if the hard challenge is to beat the level in 1 minute and 55 seconds, and then the easy challenge is to beat it in like 2 minutes and 30 seconds, if you beat it in 1 minute and 55 in hard mode, then that only completes the hard mode challenge, it doesn't complete the easy mode challenge. You have to actually go and play it in easy mode in order to complete that challenge. And similarly, if you get a time of under 155 in easy mode, that doesn't complete the challenge for hard mode. So if you want to do all of the challenges in the game, then you need to play every single level minimum 3 times, but more likely it's going to take even more than that, as some of these challenges you really have to go out of your way for, and they're going to conflict with other challenges and make it impossible to get all of them in one run. So yeah, doing all this challenge shit kind of fucking sucks, and to be honest, I did not bother to do it, because after doing it in the first level, I was like, okay, fuck this is just a giant hassle, a giant waste of time. And the things that you do to complete these challenges, for the most part, are just like stuff you would normally do by playing the game, or really tedious and annoying things like actively going out of your way to attack your opponent like 8 times throughout the race, which you're only really going to do if they're not way behind you because you're way better than them, because the AI is really easy in this game. So all that really turns into is you slowly trailing behind the AI and hitting them a bunch of times, and then you just finish the race like normal. Not exactly what I would call the most engaging of extra content. And if you can complete all of the challenges in a zone, then you eventually unlock a cup that you can play, which is basically just a series of races that are all chained together where It's basically best 2 out of 3, which, like, I guess, whatever. Again, you complete challenges for doing this that can unlock you more cards, but who really cares? It's just doing stuff that you've already done. It's just completing more races. The fact that they're strung together doesn't really make them any more difficult or challenging, considering how easy to beat the AI is. And remember that completing these challenges doesn't just directly unlock the cards, they just give you random cards that you're just gonna get eventually as you keep playing. So even if you complete every single challenge and every single cup in the game, it's very likely that you're still going to have a bunch of cards that you have to just grind for to unlock by just repeatedly completing challenges you've already completed. Yeah, this whole process in Sonic Rivals 1 really friggin' sucks, and I would not recommend doing it. Honestly, if you want my recommendation, then the way to get the most out of Sonic Rivals is to play through the story mode once as one character, and then just download a save file that has everything unlocked so you get access to Metal Sonic and all the costumes, and then just play the game to your leisure. I think that's definitely the best way to get the most out of it. And for me, personally, of course, another way that I like to get out of it, because this game is so similar to traditional 2D Sonic games, I of course wanted to try time attacking the game, and I did find that to be quite fun, as the level design is pretty good and very much in line with traditional Sonic level design structure. The only main issue with it is that there's no way to play the game just like solo without the AI there, so you always have that kind of inconsistent element fucking with you where they might use power-ups to slow you down or hit you and make you miss shortcuts. There can be a lot of frustration that comes with dealing with the AI, which is annoying. You can, at the very least, though, mitigate this by avoiding racing against the characters that have abilities that just automatically fuck with you in an unavoidable way, like Knuckles, Shadow, and Silver, that just have passive effects that get applied to you with their special abilities. Whereas if you race against Sonic, then his boost ability, the AI is really not ever going to really be able to interact with you with that, because if you're time attacking, then you're completing the level just about as quickly as possible, and there's no way the AI is ever going to get close to you. But of course, you also want that speed boost ability, as it's the only special ability that actually helps you get faster clear times, and so personally, I like to time attack the game as Metal Sonic racing against Sonic. That way my opponent has the boost ability, but I also copy his ability, and thus I also have access to it. And you know, once you get a little bit of ahead of the AI, you don't ever really even have to think about them again. I mean, they will occasionally throw power-ups at you, but if you get far enough ahead of them, even those won't be able to reach you, so it's only kind of an issue at the beginning of the race. I mean, they actually can still catch up to you, because let me tell you, these AIs rubber band like motherfuckers. They will go insanely fast when they're off screen in order to catch up to you in completely bullshit and unfair ways. But even with their super aggressive rubber banding, when you're time attacking, they're never gonna catch you pretty much. Once you get going, then it can basically just turn into a traditional 2D Sonic game time attack, and in that way, I think that Rivals can definitely be very fun. Not my favorite Sonic game for time attack by any means, but an enjoyable time. I'll take it over, like, Advance 2 at the very least. And to be a bit nerdy, I kinda like that the best way to play the game for time is to play it as either Sonic or Metal Sonic versus the other, because then it kinda makes it like this is Metal Sonic game, because he's never actually been playable, like, as a main character in a mainline Sonic game before. But with this game kind of being like a mainline Sonic game, then it's kind of a chance for Metal to get his time to shine. But then at the same time, you have to be racing against Sonic the whole time, which is just perfectly appropriate for Metal. That said, another way you can tell this game is a bit unfinished is that not every zone in this game is complete. There are 2 zones that only actually have 1 act, and the second act is just the same level again, but they've changed the look of it, and they've remixed the placements of the hazards. And not every zone has a boss fight, so you can definitely see that they had to cut some corners in this game. So yeah, that's Sonic Rivals 1. Very good game. I actually quite like it. I mean, I don't think it's like super duper amazing. As a racing game, it's like okay, it's very repetitive and it doesn't have a ton of content in it. But if you're someone that just likes 2D Sonic games and you particularly like time attacking Sonic games, then I definitely think that there is quite a bit to get out of this game. And I actually think there's even more to get out of Sonic Rivals 2, as Sonic Rivals 2 basically just takes everything that was in Sonic Rivals 1 and makes it even better. Of course, it does the baseline things, like we got a whole slew of new tracks here, we got a bunch of new playable characters with extra abilities and all that, but in terms of the core gameplay, Sonic Rivals 2 plays pretty much exactly identically to the first Sonic Rivals game. The only difference in this game is something that I think is quite a nice improvement, actually. They have changed the unique character special abilities from being items that you get randomly to now being governed by a meter that you fill by collecting lums, which I absolutely prefer, as it adds much more of a skill-based element to earning and using these abilities than just randomly the level design is going to grant them to you. Though, to be fair, there were some cool instances in Sonic Rivals 1 where there would be shortcuts that you would want to take specifically because even if it ended up being a little bit slower, there was a special ability available on that path that made it worth taking. And there were even, like, items that would cycle through various different items and eventually would go to the special ability, and you would actually kind of want to time when you get to that item, so that way it's the special move when you pick it up. There was actually some kind of cool routing you could do there, but Sonic Rivals 2 adds for much, much cooler routing, as now collecting lums is something you actually need to think about, because that's something that did not matter whatsoever in the first Rivals game. You didn't even really have to worry about them as health, because in the Rivals games, you only lose 10 lums when you get hit, as opposed to all of them, meaning it's pretty much impossible to die, because, you know, you're playing through the level, you're picking up tons of these things. By the time you have like 60 lums, you have 6 hit points. You're basically never gonna die at that point. So there was pretty much zero incentive to even think about lums in the first Rivals game, but Rivals 2 gives you a great reason to actually go out of your way to collect these things. And it could potentially also add further depth to actually racing, because if you're right behind your opponent, they're going to be collecting all the lums, so it might be better to intentionally take a different route, so that way the lums are there and you can collect them and use your special ability to catch up. So that's a really great improvement. I definitely like that a lot. And then as far as the story mode campaign is concerned, they have done a little bit to try to make things a bit more interesting in Sonic Rivals, and that you don't just race your opponents every single level in the game. Sometimes you will actually have special levels where you do some kind of other objective, like kill a certain number of enemies, or collect a certain number of lums, or find a couple of hidden chow in the level. Sometimes you won't be racing an opponent at all. Sometimes it'll just be single player and you have to complete the level in a certain amount of time, which did happen occasionally in the first Sonic Rivals, but that is the only story mode event that ever happened. Which, you know, they try to use these to spice things up, though to be honest, I don't really think that they do very much. They don't really change that much about how you play the game, so it's kinda just whatever. The more significant thing that they've added is all of the zones are now 3 acts long, though the second act is not just a normal level. Instead, it is a battle arena where you have to compete against your opponent in some kind of combat-esque challenge, like killing them a certain number of times, or collecting more lums than them within a given allotted time, or there's even stuff like capture the flag, where you have to like go into the opponent's base and take a chow and take it back to your base. One thing that they've done to make the combat a little bit better in Rivals 2 is they've now added a counter move where anytime your opponent is homing attacking you or trying to melee you, if you press the attack button while they're coming after you, then you'll instead counter them and they'll take a hit instead of you, which is cool, and I do see it having a lot of potential for fighting against an actual person in terms of trying to predict when they're going to attack and all that. But against the AI, they will just always attack you the moment they get in range, and so you can just repeatedly counter easily, and there's basically nothing they can do about it. And to be honest, I really do not like these levels at all. They are very, very clunky, very awkward, very shitty, and the AI is so stupid and so bad that in a lot of these, they stand no chance, and you can kill them in like 3 seconds. They're not the worst thing in the world, but they certainly don't add to the game in a very positive way, if you ask me, and I would prefer if they weren't here, because they kind of fuck with the pacing quite a bit. Also, another thing Rivals 2 has over the first one is that every zone is actually complete, with a full number of acts and a boss fight for every single one, which is not something that Rivals had. As far as the boss fights in Rivals 2, they're pretty much the same deal as Rivals 1. They're a little bit more interestingly designed, but they're also a lot more annoying to fight, as they're a lot more difficult to hit, with a lot more, like, awkward vulnerability opportunities, where it's kind of just like a pain in the ass with how clunky these games can be. Oh yeah, and also another thing is that now that we have 8 playable characters, that means 8 playthroughs of the main game story mode if you want to do everything and unlock everything. And once again, all the characters play pretty much identically to each other aside from their special abilities. So this still sucks, and now it sucks kind of even more as you have to do it even more times. Though, credit where it's due, they have totally fixed the card unlocking system in this game, because now the cards are not given to you randomly. Now every card is directly equated to a specific challenge, and completing that challenge will get you that card. And a lot of these challenges are things that you're just going to naturally do over time. You know, get S ranks on these certain levels, complete levels in certain amounts of time, complete the battle arenas without getting killed or whatever, blah, 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 blah. You also do have the kind of like milestones type challenges that you kind of just have to chip away at over time, like collect this many lums or attack your opponent 100 times or use 50 power-ups or whatever that you're just eventually going to unlock through natural play. And all of these challenges are just available at all times. There's no longer like separated into difficulty modes or whatever. You can just play the game, and if you complete a challenge, you'll unlock it. So that is very much improved. And I actually did bother to go out of my way to complete a lot of these challenges in this game this time around, because it really wasn't that much of a pain in the ass at all. It encouraged me to try to play all of the parts of the game and learn everything and get good, and it was fairly fun. I didn't unlock absolutely everything, as some of those milestone challenges that you're just going to get eventually, they take quite a while to unlock, as you have to do quite a lot of specific certain things. And that's one of those things where, you know, eventually you're just going to get them, but personally, again, I say you're probably just better off just downloading a save file once you've completed enough challenges that you feel personally satisfied. One thing that they have added to Sonic Rivals 2 that I am extremely grateful for is they have added the ability to play the game completely single player without an AI opponent that you have to race against. Fuck yeah, dude, but before we get to Time Attack, there is actually a special thing to do when playing in this mode, which is that every level has 10 hidden Chao around that you can try to find. And immediately that sounds like it's setting off red flags of like, oh god, hunting for collectibles in linear levels, it's gonna require playing it a billion goddamn times and then looking up where the last couple of locations are. But actually, no, you don't have to do that in Sonic Rivals 2. As one of the things that you can unlock for completing some of the challenges is a Chao detector for every zone that will just have an arrow pointing you to where the Chao are hidden. So there you go, if you want to avoid a headache, just unlock the Chao detectors first, and then you can get them all no problem very easily. But also, I don't even necessarily think that would be too necessary, because a lot of the time, most of the Chao aren't actually hidden. They're not in, like, areas where you would never possibly know where they are, and you have to try to figure out where they might be by looking around and scouring every single nook and cranny. Instead, they mostly kind of put the Chao on the main path of the optimal route through the level, and that actually works really well to teach the player what the fastest routes are. In fact, while hunting for Chao, there were a number of shortcuts I discovered that I didn't even know existed. And I think that is a really brilliant way to do collectibles in a Sonic game, where you put them all on the optimal route, and that encourages the player to actually learn what the optimal route is. I would like to see that kind of thing brought into more mainline Sonic games. I think that's awesome. Collecting all the Chao in this game was not only not a problem, it was pretty damn fun, so thumbs up. I think this is the first time that getting collectibles in a Sonic game has actually been enjoyable. And then, of course, upon seeing that you had the ability to play this game single player, I was like, oh yes, finally, now we get a proper Time Attack mode. And that is something that we absolutely get. Again, I just like to play as Metal Sonic here, because you don't really get to play as Metal Sonic very much in Sonic games. Although technically I'm playing as Metal Sonic 3.0 for the real Sonic Rivals OGs out there. But anyway, playing Sonic Rivals 2 for Time Attack is so much better than Sonic Rivals 1. The fact that you don't have to worry about an AI, that's great in and of itself, but the real thing that really stood out to me that made this way more fun than the first game was the new meter system for your special ability. When you're playing for Time Attack and you're really trying to optimize, this adds such an excellent layer of depth to the routing of how you play, because you really want to go out of your way to collect lums in this, because that meter fills fucking fast, and it allows you to get those boosts off very regularly if you're collecting a lot of them as you play through the level. You can get boosts almost back to back if you play your cards right and boost in the right situations. And this adds a really good element of actually having to go out of your way to collect as many lums as possible on your way to the end, which is something that I think many Sonic games have struggled to do with their design. They kind of managed to get that into the games a little bit with the boost mode introduced in Advance 2, but I would argue this is an actually far better version of that, as you have a much greater incentive to go out of your way to collect these things because of how many boosts you can get off if you are really collecting very well. And there's also extra layers of depth here in terms of where you want to be using the boosts, because there's a lot of set pieces and scripted moments where you're not really going to be speeding up very much because of it. And so you're better off holding off on using your boost there, and that requires, learning the level and routing out more intelligently, and there's a lot there that you actually really get. This meter management system here is actually far more interesting than even the meter management you get in something like Sonic Rush. It's really damn cool, and it makes me think that I would love meter management to become more of a regular mechanic in the Sonic games. And no, I'm not talking about the boost meter once we get to those games, because a lot of times you don't even really have to think about that when you're playing. I'm talking about some sort of meter or resource or something that's tied to collecting lums that really gives you a lot to think about, kind of actually similar to like the meters in like Shadow the Hedgehog did in that game. Although again, I would say this is superior to even that. This system is just so good and adds so much to the gameplay. And because there are some extra characters in this game, there are actually a couple other characters that have abilities that actually do offer different routing through the level where you can take advantage of what they can do. For example, Tails with his flight, you can use that to climb up to areas much faster in cases of vertical platforming. Unfortunately, that's pretty much the only other ability that really allows you to play the game in a different way platforming-wise. I really wish that instead of just abilities that would fuck with the opponent, all of the unique character abilities were some kind of cool movement thing that they could uniquely do. I think that would be way better. Though it does make sense that, this being a racing game, attacking your opponent is something you want to do with the items. It's just that after getting a taste of how richly you can add to the time attack with the routing of this whole meter thing, I'm like, oh, if there was even more of this stuff, that would be so fucking cool. It is also worth mentioning that I do think the level design of Sonic Rivals 2 is quite a bit better than the level design of the first game, as they have dramatically reduced the amount of set pieces where you just kind of hold right and watch a cutscene happen, basically. Those are still there, but they are definitely in less volume, and they don't go on for nearly as long in this game, which is quite nice. I mean, if you think about it, those don't even make any sense at all to put in a racing game, because there's no opportunity for either player to interact with the other one in these sequences. I mean, I guess you can still get knocked off of them with items and they just fall to your death because you're not supposed to fall off these things because they're scripted set pieces, because that's how these things work in Sonic. If you don't just hold forward and do what they tell you to do, then they completely fucking break, which I guess that now turns into a mechanic in Rivals if you're using items to fuck with your opponent. But I wouldn't exactly call that the greatest of game design. As I've said before, this whole set piece thing is just not something that I care very much for in Sonic, so if a game reduces the amount of those, that to me is a good thing. So there you go, there's the Sonic Rivals games. Pretty damn good, actually. I was surprised coming back to these games how much I enjoyed them. I remember when I had a PSP and I played them back when they first came out, I was like, they're okay, whatever. But coming back to them now that I am much more knowledgeable about Sonic games and how they work and how they're designed and actually getting good at these games and time attacking them, I'm like, damn, these are kind of basically like mainline Sonic games, sort of, in terms of like the core gameplay and design. They are very, very similar, and you can definitely get a similar gameplay experience out of them. They're pretty fucking fun. I would genuinely really be interested in actually playing these games against another player that really knows Sonic games pretty well and I can actually have some good competition with, because I could definitely see that being a really good time. Certainly not my favorite Sonic games in the world by any stretch, but they are solid games that I would recommend if you enjoy Sonic games. Because to me, that's kind of what they are. Like I said, I think you could argue whether or not these games are spin-offs, because they certainly do kind of have a bit of the feel of mainline Sonic games. And I like them for that. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.